Alright, so first things first, we're going to be jumping back onto the Morris and get the engine out of this old girl. So, as you saw in previous episodes, we removed the gearbox. This thing was pretty easy to get out. It was a little bit of dicking around, but you know, all in all, it was pretty straightforward. So, first things first, when you go to remove an engine, you need to disconnect the battery. You need to disconnect negative and you need to disconnect positive. Really good idea here is to put the battery on charge and don't have a notebook sitting over the top. So once you've got on charge, you then need to start removing all of the fuel lines that go to the engine, along with any coolant lines. So I've done videos before on how to remove an engine from a classic Mini. This is no different. Essentially, you want to remove all the fuel lines, all the coolant lines. You want to remove the exhaust, the intake system, if anything, the radiator. We need to remove probably the alternator as well, I reckon. Top and bottom radiator hose, engine mounts, and any extra wiring, any extra earths that may be down in there. Spark plugs, we probably leave those in. Throttle cable, choke cable, probably remove those. Yeah, pretty much as you can. So let's get onto it. Let's get this thing out so we can start stripping it. Now, once we get it out, we do need to strip it right down to the bare essentials. The reason for that is we're going to be sending to the machine shop. But before we send to the machine shop, we're going to go out and go see Colin from Sprite Parts in Dural, I think he is. Yeah, something like that. So from where I live, it's about a 45-minute drive. So he's going to go through everything with us. We're going to be talking about all the parts, the things that we're going to be using, what's going to be happening to this engine, how we get the most performance out of it, all that sort of stuff. So I'll take you guys along for the journey. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alrighty folks, welcome back. So as you can see here, we are removing the radiator as the next part of the removal process of the engine. Now, even though I'd already drained the radiator, there's always generally a little bit of coolant in there. So whenever you have a radiator that you're removing, always make sure you've got plenty of towels or drip trays underneath it. That way when you pull it out, it's not going to drip coolant everywhere. As well, make sure that when you put it in a container when you're finished, to make sure that it catches all of the coolant that's coming out of it. Otherwise, you're going to drip coolant absolutely everywhere. Next step is to loosen off the drive belt, and while you're there, you can not only replace the belt but also put it to the side, note the direction of rotation, and if need be, you can replace it. Now, it is quite an easy thing to do, and once you do it, you don't generally need to maintain it unless it's losing tension. After that, it's just removal of the distributor, the spark plugs, and the inlet manifold. Now, it is worthwhile noting as well, when you remove a distributor, to make sure you note which way it comes out and which way the spindle drive that runs off the camshaft goes in relation to the distributor itself. Otherwise, you go to reassemble it, it won't start first go. Chances are it'll probably be out by about 180 degrees. Here you can see I'm trying to get the spindle drive out, but unfortunately I couldn't because it was buried well inside the engine head. So the next part of the journey was to try and remove the entire manifold itself. It turns out that after many minutes or even longer of persevering, I was unable to remove the manifold with it inside the car, and you'll find out the exact reason why shortly. This had quite a large restriction to the inlet, and as you can see when I pull off this inlet pipe that goes from the air filter assembly, which is just where my head is there, all the way down to the inlet of the carburetor, it is quite small and it is quite restrictive. Considering this vehicle made around 32 to 33 horsepower originally, it obviously didn't need quite a lot of air going into the engine, and therefore it didn't need anything major like we're going to be looking into in the future and any serious modifications. Now, it is a very basic SU carburetor, so there was no drama getting that off. Once we got it off, we were then able to remove the engine properly. Right, we're back. There was a couple of little things that I didn't show you guys that I did simply because didn't really see the point. But for those of you who don't know how to do this job, it was pretty easy. So from where I was up to, essentially I removed the carburetor assembly. Now I did try and loosen off the studs, or the nuts should I say, for the exhaust manifold. So number 1, number 2, they're both loose. Number 3 was quite difficult. Number 4
See if I can get it in there. See how bad that is. Someone's just absolutely butchered that, so I'm gonna have to, when I get it out of the car, probably have to sit there with a pair of multi grips and just hope to God, pray to God that it comes off. But look, I get it. Shit happens sometimes, things break, and you know, you got to do what you can. But I would have put that one probably towards the front. The front one's probably the easiest to get to. This is probably not the hardest, but it's probably one of the harder ones to get to. Actually, number 3 is probably the worst because of where it's situated directly here, and the carburetor sits directly there as well. Now, you probably saw in the video, there's a couple of gaskets as well. There was this one, and the one that comes off about here and then goes up. That gasket is also shot. Now, I've removed the spark plugs just for, not the fact of easier removal, but I didn't want to destroy them with the chain when I run it over the top of the engine. So what I've done here is run a D-shackle through the exhaust manifold. So a really good Tomo's tech tip here is when you're using a D-shackle, tighten it all the way up. Once it stops, back it off half a turn. The reason for that is if you're doing some towing, you're doing some lifting, over time that can stress, which can then cause it to tighten up, and then once it tightens up, and if you don't have a pair of pliers on you, you will not get that bolt undone. So just loosen off half a turn to a turn. So what I've done is I've run that chain all the way over. Now, I was hoping, there is a bracket on the back. I'll just show you guys. Yes, I do have my fan going to the middle of nowhere because once again, it's another hot summer's day and it's muggy again. So what I was going to do was on the back of this alternator bracket here, so this is the cylinder head right here. Being a flathead engine, that is the cylinder head. So there's a bracket that runs all the way along here. So there is a hole at the back, hopefully you guys can see, just where my finger is there. I was hoping to run the D-shackle through there and pull up off there, but that's not going to work. So I've just opted to run it through the top of the cylinder head. Now, this should support it enough. I wouldn't imagine the engine's going to be that heavy, so we should be okay. Down the front, we do have 4 support bolts. So these down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen off the last bolt on either side. I've pretty much loosened them all. And then we should be right lifted up. When it gets up high enough, there is a nut on the front side of it. Let me just grab my other torch, hold on. Okay, so, sorry, we'll take 2. So the front, there's a nut just down in there, which I'm gonna have to undo when I get it up, and then we can remove the engine mounts on either side. I'm gonna replace those. The V-belt as well for the alternator was in absolutely shocking condition, so we're going to replace that, and some other things as well. So let's pray to God we can get this thing out without removing the bonnet. The whole front end is also able to be removed. Sorry, I'll turn that fan off for a second because otherwise you're not going to be able to hear anything. So the whole front apron, you can remove this chrome piece here. So from the back side, behind this guard, there's a couple of nuts that hold that chrome piece on. That'll then come off. You undo these 2 here. I think you then pull the grill out. There's a couple more bolts down in there. I think you can see, yeah, there's a couple there. And then there's bolts down all the way under there, all the way along. So you can take that front apron off, which is really cool. And it does have an old crank handle opening here as well, which is really interesting to think that this car in the 50s, they still had crank handles, and you can see the crank bolt just there. So it has an eccentric on it, so when you go to turn it and it starts, it'll actually kick the rod out, so it's not going to break your arm. I always wondered about that and wondered how that happened. And you know, you didn't snap your arm every time you started the engine. So yeah, to remove this thing, it is very, 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 very simple. The fact that we have the gearbox out makes it a lot easier. So let's get this thing out and pray to God we don't have to remove the bonnet. If we do, so be it. We just have to make some marks and just make sure that we line it back up. Other than that, you can just remove the front apron. So let's jump into it.
So once again, we're on to removing the engine. Now it is worthwhile also noting that you not only need an engine crane, a couple of chains and some D-shackles or even bolts, you also need to be making sure that you wear safety boots. If this thing drops on your foot, you are likely to cut it straight off or do some serious nerve and bone damage. So whilst I'm here, I'm also taking photos of it as it comes out, just so I can take note as to where everything goes, how it came out, and anything specific that needed to be noted upon removal. It just cleared the bonnet, thank goodness.
Right, so as you can see, she is out pretty easy. I don't know exactly how much this thing weighs, but I can't imagine it to be that much. Now, as you saw, between the bonnet and the top of the engine crane, there was what we call a bee's dick here in Australia. So it was quite tight, but fairly easy. Now, one of the things that actually happened on the way out, the engine mount completely detached from the passenger side, so we're going to get new engine mounts because that thing was just absolutely cactus. But you can just see how much room is in this thing. Like, it's just phenomenal. You could probably put a small block Chevy in here, even just like a blown V6. Like, this thing is just amazing. There's like legit between the panel here, so where the bonnet closes, and there's probably at least 1.5 foot. Like, that's massive. And then you still have like where the sump sits. So if you cut all of this out, man, I would love to see what people do with these cars. So if you have one of these cars and you've put something in there, an SR20, you've put a big block or even just a small block Chevy, or, you know, anything, a Windsor, Cleveland, whatever, let me know. I'd love to know in the section below. Just comment, just let me know. It'd be really cool to see what people have done with these. I guess to turbo these things would be pretty sick as well. You'd probably have to change a lot of stuff. But man, the amount of room in this engine bay is just second to none. And you don't see that very often, not in modern day cars anyway, because they're just full of crap and plastic and computers and pipes and EGRs and all this stuff. Anyway, so let's get on to setting this thing up. Hopefully I can put this thing on the engine stand. I'm really hoping that I can just mount it straight to it. As I was showing you guys before, sorry, I'll just grab my torch, the flywheel is just an amazing style setup. I'm really unsure as to why it's like that, but you know, it's obviously like that for a reason. So what I'm going to have to do is, and it looks like the bell housing, I guess, is part of the block, I guess. Okay, so this lower part is part of the sump. Man, that's just, it's weird. It's different. It's cool. So what I need to do is probably just leave it, I guess, suspended on the crane. I was hoping I could just flip it upside down, rip the sump off, pull the pistons and that out, but in saying that, I'm going to have to take the head off to do it. So I'm really quite interested now as to how I'm going to do this. Obviously I'll have to mount it probably just on the back of the engine, which is odd, but there's 4 bolt holes. Like, there's one here, there and there. Maybe I can just make it work. Like, I'm gonna have to make it work. I've seen someone do it, so it'd be really interesting to see how this thing actually comes apart and whatnot. So yeah, really interested. So let's get into doing that. Hopefully I can get some bolts long enough to do that. Until then, I'll probably just remove the sump. Actually, yeah, I'll just leave it on the engine stand for now. I'll take the sump off, do as much as I can from underneath, maybe even the timing chain setup at the front, try and pull the camshaft out, and just work out how to get these valves out of it, because I'm not entirely sure on how this thing comes apart. Like, it's got a side cover similar to the Mini behind me, but yeah, I just honestly don't know. So we're going to tackle this thing together and we're going to have a look. But I'm really interested to see how this comes apart. I don't think I've ever really watched a video. I watched one little video online. I forget who it was. I don't even remember. So I apologise to that person. I'll try and remember. I'll try and put a link in there of the guy's video that I saw, or at least a link to their video of doing a rebuild. But yeah, probably just pull the timing chain off, I guess, and then just pull as much stuff off it as I can, and then go from there, I guess. It seems pretty straightforward. Like, it doesn't seem overly difficult. So anyway, let's give it a go. Let's jump into it and see what's inside, see if there's any witness marks, anything been worn, any scoring, all that sort of jazz.
Hey everyone, Tomo here. I'm sorry that I've had to cut the episode short. I decided to do so because the length of the video became too long and I'd probably end up losing the interest of people. So I made it quite a short one this time, but next episode we're going to go into stripping the engine, and then what we found on the inside of the engine was actually quite interesting, and what we need to do moving forward to find out how to get this thing up and running to the specifications that the customer's after. So like always guys, thanks heaps for watching. We'll see you right here on another episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups.